Selanjutnya, kami persilakan Bapak Backhouse selaku Global Expert Stray Animals in Need of Care dari PAWS International. Temanya kali ini adalah The Role of Collective Movements in Advancing Animal Welfare under Indonesia's New Predator.
Hello, selamat pagi, good morning. Thank you everybody. Good morning, still awake? No, okay. So I'm going to be presenting on behalf of my colleague Nina Jamal. This is her presentation, but sadly she's unable to make it due to some flight problems. So I will do my best. I'm just going to wait for the slides. Okay, next slide please. So yes, we're going to talk today a little bit about animal welfare advocacy in turbulent times. And apologies, I can't speak fast Indonesian. So just want to start out and say, does anybody know that feeling when you worked on something for a long time but it could go wrong at any moment, just like this presentation? Like back in the days for all the old people where there was no Microsoft Word, we had no autosave, we had no cloud. So I guess this is the kind of sentiment that's going to be put across with the work from taking sort of animal advocacy through to legislation, through to sort of binding international agreements. It's a lot of work and it's often very fragile. Next, please. Next one. So over the years, on the work for animal welfare, there's been this kind of sense from our colleagues at PAWS and other international advocacy groups working on pandemics agreement that this could just go wrong at any time. So today what we're going to talk about is just how this kind of happened in real time, how a global pandemic really drove forward efforts for animal advocacy, and how One Health, which we hopefully now all recognize as an important sort of vehicle for animal welfare, has now made its way into a legally binding agreement for the very first time. Okay, next please. Next. Okay, so just to show of hands, who in here is working on advocacy for legal change for animals? I think, sorry, maybe nobody? Who's here working on kind of legislation, legal change? Don't be shy, it's not a test. Okay, great, thank you. So I'm sure all of you know it's an uphill battle, like working for legal change is incredibly difficult. So in the presentation from the Ginti, talking about the criminal code being updated in Indonesia, as well as having the governor of Jakarta here, advocating for legal change, banning dog and cat meat in Jakarta. These are huge steps forward in Indonesia, it's super impressive, but it's not very common. Around the world, we recognize that governments have different priorities, and often animal welfare is not at the top of their list. Next, please. But when COVID happened, which feels like a lifetime ago, but really was only 4 years, this pandemic sort of, because of the scale and the global impact, the loss of life, economy, trade, infrastructure, all of these things made it really sort of immediate and important that this kind of crisis is inevitable, and we really need to take actions from sort of NGOs, civil society and governments to make sure that something like this just doesn't happen again. And it also brought to the attention of policymakers that disease can now spread between animals and humans. Next slide please. And this is something that we've known for a long time in animal advocacy, also the kind of public health sector, that zoonotic diseases or emerging infectious diseases, 70% of them originate in animals. But I think this was really brought to public awareness during COVID-19. And again, it's not to make animals the enemy or to demonize them in any way, it's just to recognize that the way humans treat animals, the way that we treat animals around the world is not okay, and it's not aligned with public health goals. They're at high risk for both species. Next slide, please. So we thought, I mean, nobody thought COVID was great, but it was an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation and say, well, this is what we as NGOs and academics, we can now say to policymakers and governments, this thing is real, this is really happening, and now we need to look at what we can do to prevent the next pandemic. Next slide, please. So what actually happened when we were looking for sort of political development and opportunity was that the conversation was more about preparing for and responding to emergencies, not about prevention. So again, the problem here, like mentioning, talking about disasters earlier on, is that there's often a response plan, a rescue plan. Like, well, why aren't we looking at stopping it happening in the first place? Because otherwise we're just going to be going around and around in a circle forever, and it will only get worse. Next slide, please. So then it became the job of PAWS and other organizations and advocacy groups to start data, writing reports, interviewing experts, policy briefs, and basically advocating for prevention rather than a response, and to try and drive this agenda forward. Next, please. So when the meetings finally happened, the focus still was not on prevention. It was still being driven towards a response, but that was because the ministries of health are the ones who are being tasked with leading this kind of policy development. But health ministries are not the ones who are, they're responsible when the emergency arrives, but not before. So it's the wrong stakeholder to be having that conversation with. Next, please. And next. So it wasn't clear then whether the government was going to change their plan and prevention. So there was all of this work that was happening. But we were fortunate in that many countries, including Indonesia. Indonesia has been a real advocate for One Health throughout this whole policy development, recognize that the health of humans, animals, and the environment are interconnected. And so they were in strong support of prevention in the treaty. So this is a really important step in kind of moving this argument forward. Next. So the next kind of chapter then was in process. So the One Health, this is the high-level expert panel, that's what Oleh stands for, was kind of the vehicle for animal welfare, but it hasn't always been that case. Often it's been about, very much focused on human health and human-centered behaviors, but not looking at the interconnection with animals. It was always about, as is often the case, how do we keep humans safe and animals are a kind of byproduct or a second. Next, please. So these concerns were raised with the high-level expert panel, and then the kind of definition of One Health was updated to include well-being. So again, it's important to look at the kind of whole system of humans, animals, and environment, and that includes the kind of social and psychological benefits of well-being. And so this definition being adopted in 2021 was a good sort of turning point in the conversation. Next, please. So, that's okay. So then in June 2022, PAWS, among a lot of other groups, went to Geneva to talk about One Health and meet with member states to try and build this case and try and advocate for this new definition of One Health in the treaties. But there were still people saying that it's not the job of the World Health Organization to talk about climate change and animals. I mean, we would respectfully disagree, but there were still plenty of diplomats and people who thought, not our job. Our job is keep people safe. Not recognizing again that climate disasters, food insecurity, animal health, zoonotic, pandemics, all often connected to animals and the environment and have impacts on people. Next, please. But there was a gap in policy, and this agreement, this pandemic agreement, had to fill it. So we had a lot of good support from academic institutions and universities to kind of recognize that this is provide data and evidence that kind of helps include the correct sort of language and the correct policy within the pandemic agreement. Next, please. Next. So it was still not that popular. One Health was still contentious, but there was actually a Friends of One Health group, which is a WhatsApp group I would love to be in, which was created to really help kind of advocate. And again, Indonesia in this group. So Indonesia has long been an advocate and supporting One Health at an international level. Next, please. There was a joint plan of action created, and there was also, next slide, please. There was also an ASEAN One Health declaration in May 2023. So the ASEAN member states were the first group of countries to endorse this One Health high-level definition, and the Joint Plan of Action. So again, you've got Western countries sort of looking at developing policies, but the ASEAN nations are the first to really recognize and implement that, which is such a brilliant thing and is a good example to lead into the rest of the world. Next, please. But then the recognition here was that when the negotiations took place, countries that didn't have their own ability to produce vaccines during COVID-19 had bigger problems. So they also had more difficulty implementing these One Health practices just because of resource availability, access to vaccine, access to production. Next, please. On the other side, countries that did have those vaccine capacities were kind of asked to focus more on prevention because they did have the sort of systems in place. So there was this kind of conflict between prevention or preparedness and response, depending on the situation in the country where it was happening. Next, please. Next. Slide is okay. What we did see, though, over this was this kind of negative kind of spiral in terms of focusing on priorities that were relevant to the country at the time, but it didn't really help the overall treaty and the overall international movement for One Health. But later there was a sort of recognition that us as animal welfare advocates, we really had to stop just talking about animal welfare. We had to get out of our silo, and we had to work with other member states. We had to recognize that One Health champions needed to be spoken to and included in the conversation. And if we didn't do that, we were never going to break out of this circular conversation. So it was important for us to speak to other expert groups and expert stakeholders. And again, this is something that we would say in your own advocacy, in your own work, and we're going to do a focus group session later this morning after lunch. Don't just stay in your lane of animal welfare. Speak to lawyers, speak to experts, speak to people from government. Like, you have to work together to have this kind of systemic long-term change. Next, please. So we finally started to see some progress until Trump, of course. So there was a lot of progress with global development of the One Health agenda, but when the US announced they were going to leave the WHO, it caused a lot of issues just because of losing funding, losing budget, so it really kind of put the brakes on. Next, please. So this is, again, came back to the conversation of, well, you know, we have to do this implementation, now we don't have budget, we're supposed to do this in a couple of years, how are we going to do it? So the risk was that people were getting stuck on the kind of implementation, the finance of it, rather than thinking about the meaningful long-term change. Again, that's understandable. You can have the best plan, the best strategy, the best will in the world. If you don't have any money to do it, you're kind of stuck before you start. Next, please. So what we had to do then was to focus on the finish line and really think about how do we get this over the line. So together with other NGOs and governments from all regions, we actually did a meeting where we co-hosted some negotiations and some discussions to really look at this kind of successful pandemic agreement with a core inclusion of One Health. This was really a priority. We didn't want to lose the momentum in 3 years of work just because of discussions of finance and because of what Donald Trump decided that afternoon. Next slide, please. And thankfully, despite there being some challenges still as to One Health being included, there were long negotiations, but there was finally some agreement and consensus on this pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, so the WHO pandemic agreement, which was actually then adopted, and One Health then became a part of a legally binding international agreement. Next slide, please. And here's just some photos from the votes. One more slide. Yeah, and so just to sum up, this is a whistle-stop tour of 4 years of intense work and advocacy, but now what we have is we have the pandemic agreement, we have One Health enshrined in that agreement at an international level, so now we have everything we need to engage governments and to really protect animals, the environment and human health, and prevent future pandemics. So this is the key thing. So what I'm going to ask of you all now as you move forward is use these tools that have been worked on and these things that have been developed in your own work, in your own advocacy. You have some really amazing expert resources behind you, and now is the time to take this forward and implement pandemics for One Health in your own work. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Terima kasih banyak.